My name is Jason.
My name is Tom.
And this is Fear of a Black Dragon, an old-school RPG podcast.
And in this episode, we set sail for saliferous shores, set shivering by spectral susurrations, seeking the sinister secret of Saltmarsh.
Our first segment is the Basic Crawl. Module U1, The Sinister Secret of Saltmarsh, is a 32-page adventure for AD&D First Edition, published by TSR in 1981. It was written by Dave J. Brown, with development by Don Turnbull. It features art by Jim Holloway, Dave DeLue, Harry Quinn, and Stephen D. Sullivan. Interestingly, this is the first adventure published by TSR UK.
So what's actually in it? Well, it begins with a preface and intro, going slightly over-elaborately into the difference between British and American English, and then gets on with it with the section The Town of Saltmarsh, and a part entitled The Legend. This describes the alchemist who used to live in the haunted house on the outskirts of the town. Saltmarsh itself is a kind of coastal fishing village with a little hidden side industry that we'll discover as we go along. The adventure is divided into two sections, and part one is called The Haunted House. There's an intro, followed by a Wandering Monsters part, and then keyed map locations. We won't go into all of them, but of note there are magic spells that are used to make spooky, dire warnings against intruders. There is a thief in one of the bedrooms who has been allegedly tied up against his will, but in fact is a secret agent sent to stop the PCs from finding out about the smuggler's den in the basement bored into the cliff below. That hideout is in a hidden cellar, which connects to a hidden cove in the cliff face. And finally, of note in this haunted house is the alchemist's hidden laboratory. It's right next to the hideout, but the other side of a room full of skeletons, and that is the explanation for why the smugglers have not found the secret lab. Then on to part two, The Sea Ghost. This part's introduction discusses how the PCs will be hired or persuaded to board the smugglers' ocean-going ship, the Sea Ghost. Then is a part about how to board the Sea Ghost and features of the ship, and then keyed map locations, so decks, cabins, and so on. Importantly here, there is a sea elf kept prisoner in a secret cell at the aft of one of the officers' cabins, and a locked cabin forward, off-limits to the crew, in which a group of lizard men are clandestine passengers.
And the book wraps up with the appendix, which has several helpful things, including a plot summary for the GM's reference, a thing that I personally love, NPC and monster stats, 20 pre-generated first-level player characters, and maps and handouts. So, Tom, let's talk about how we've used this in our games. I've only read it in anticipation of this episode.
All right, I've run it in 2 sessions, one for each part, using the system that I'm going to guess you haven't played yourself, called A Bandeira do Elefante da Arara, which means the elephant and macaw banner. And that is a game from Brazil set in...
Oh, that old thing.
That old thing. Set in colonial Brazil, so the 1500s. Which is a pretty straightforward traditional setup for, GM and players that uses just a kind of skills-based system. So not OSR as such, but fairly mainstream. And of course, doing that meant that I had to change the setting a little bit. Saltmarsh became Salgado, and the names of NPCs had to become kind of Portuguese or Tupi. But basically, it just ran the same.
Awesome. Let's talk about things we liked about The Sinister Secret of Saltmarsh. I'll kick off by saying that I thought the haunted house and ship maps were very good, and that the keyed locations were quite helpful. I could easily see a situation where I would recontextualize both of these resources for another adventure. Like, you could very easily just take some of this material from the haunted house and drop it into something else. Same thing with the ship. Lots of good little details in there. This is particularly the case because many of the locations that you explore in both maps are empty, or they have lots of descriptive detail, but there's nothing super plot relevant going on in some of the spaces. I'm reminded a bit of one of the few things I liked about Legend of Maine, which is the quite nice detailed map and location key for the Opera House.
Yes, like with the theatre in Legerdemain, if you need a theatre for your game, grab that. And here I would use the town of Saltmarsh or the ship, I think. I would quite happily just drop it in as a smuggler's vessel. Although I will confess that there's a 3/4 kind of perspective illustration of the ship that features a ridiculous ladder going from like near the poop deck up to the crow's nest, and I photoshopped it out before I gave it to my players because it just irritated me.
Awesome. What's something you liked about it, Tom?
I think the alchemist's house, the haunted house, that first part is just great. It's a Scooby-Doo mystery because hey, those lights they see at night, they're not ghosts, they're smugglers. Spoiler alert. Well, it's a spoiler podcast, but because it's a world where magic actually exists and ghosts are real and stuff, there's another reveal under that. So there actually are scary Halloween monsters in the form of the alchemist's remaining skeletons lurking down next to the smuggler's hideout. So it's kind of another layer of switcheroo. So it's really kind of weird. It's kind of funny that because it's a world where magic is quite common, when you discover, oh, it's fantastical sorcery, that's actually the thing that tells you not to worry rather than to worry.
Right, I know. I agree with you. You haven't said it on the show yet, but we've talked about it before. I agree with you that I think the haunted house portion of this module is more interesting than the sea ghost part. And for that very reason, like you said, it has this like kind of Scooby-Doo quality to it. Like you said, there's like multiple layers going on and it's very fun. Like I haven't played it, but I can imagine it being very, very fun when the players like discover, oh, okay, there's something else going on. Oh, it's just smugglers. And oh, there's an illusionist here. You know, okay, I got it. And then there's like undead as well, right? Like there actually is like sorcery. It's pretty cool. It's a cool thing.
It gives you a twist, but it also fulfills the original promise of it because I think it's a well-known, fact in role-playing that surprise twists are almost never good. Mainly because everyone hates the fact that, you know, they signed up for one thing, they're getting another. Also because the surprise twist is almost always Cthulhu. And no one is surprised. But in the case of Saltmarsh, it's sort of okay because both the things are true. You know, oh, it wasn't really haunted, except it kind of was, except it kind of wasn't. So, yeah, everybody's happy.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'll tell you something that I appreciated about the module, and this is the case with both halves, both the haunted house and the ship portion. I found that in their way, in their sort of fantasy campaign setting way, I found that they were both like quite realistic. And I know realistic is not maybe the perfect word to use here, but what I mean by that is many of the spaces that you explore are sort of pleasingly mundane, and even the few monsters that you encounter, and there are not many, the few monsters you encounter, they feel like they're part of a believable ecology, I suppose. You have, you know, a slime in the sort of wet cove, you know, area. You have sturges nesting in the rafters. You have a giant spider stuck in the chimney, weasels, rats, that kind of thing. On the ship part, there were lots of little touches that I thought, being a former sailor myself, actually went really, really far toward like making it feel like a realistic space. And the one that sticks out to me, or two actually. One, on the ship, you can find a book of erotic poetry. Okay, that's the first thing. And the second thing that the module talks about is how the crew quarters smells really bad. Okay. And I will tell you in real life, that's true. The crew quarters does smell really bad. And the erotic poetry thing is really funny. I'm reminded of a story from my Navy days. So one deployment, which was like 6 months out on the water, right? One deployment, and this is, I'm going to date myself a little bit here, but the Sleeping Beauty trilogy by Anne Rice kind of took over the boat. Someone had copies of these books. These are like erotic novels, right? Very dirty, very like, S&M, BDSM kind of thing. And one person, one shipmate of mine had all three of them. And he would read one and pass it to the next person, and then the next one get passed around, and these books were like circulating around the ship, right? And it was the kind of thing where where this is coming from, right? It's because we're all like mostly dudes stuck on a ship, right? With, very few like sexual outlets. And it was just kind of like I don't know, when I read the little erotic poetry detail on the Sea Ghost, like really stuck out to me. I was like, yep, that's what sailors would be doing, you know?
Yeah, I think the number of different things that's happening on the Sea Ghost is kind of the strength of that section. And there are lots of these little things you can discover through secondary, so basically by rifling through people's belongings. And in each different person's kind of cabin or just hammock area, it does feel like they're the belongings of different people, and you can infer these different backstories. Like there's the one guy who's looking up how to not get hanged for piracy when he returns to shore in legal books, and then there's the guy with like at least 2 different wives and families in different ports that you can read his letters.
Yeah, absolutely. Even the haunted house portion too, like both portions just had this sort of like realistic lived in quality. And even where like they were kind of mundane, like some of the stuff we've been talking about, it still resonated. So I thought that was pretty great. Well, so then Tom, let's move on to questions we had about the module. Why don't you start?
Yeah, mine's a kind of big picture one for part 2. As we've kind of mentioned earlier, the second half is maybe not as well realised as the first. This is the part where you, having discovered the secret of the haunted house, are tasked to go and get onto the smuggler's ship that comes to and from the town. And it kind of assumes that the player characters are going to board the ship with the intention of capturing, or it kind of seems more like murdering everyone on board. And now my group didn't go for that at all. And I know what I did, but how would you handle a group that just doesn't take a confrontational approach to this ship?
Well, you know, it's really funny because this work that the player characters are engaged in, when I was in the Navy, this is what our ship did. We hunted smugglers, right? Like in the Persian Gulf, right? So we would send little groups of security people out on these small boats, as the player characters do in the module, to the smuggler boat. We would surreptitiously board the smuggler boat, arrest everybody on the smuggler boat, and bring them back. And what I find really interesting about comparing like what this module assumed you're going to do, which is like have this like bloody confrontation, versus how it always went for us, you know, in modern day smuggler ship, you know, hunting exercises, it's not actually like a high conflict thing. It never is, in fact, as far as I know. It's very, very rarely. Oftentimes these modern day pirates, modern day smugglers are a very small handful of people on a giant oil tanker, right? And when you board them, they don't care about that oil enough to sacrifice their lives for it. And so they give up immediately. And it's actually kind of a friendly thing. They get brought back to the ship. We arrest them. We put them in our ship's little brig. But it's also kind of like chill. Like you talk to them and chat with them. And like, you know, it's like they do their thing in the world. We do our thing in the world. And it's just the way it is, right? I could definitely see a situation where like if the party wanted to just sort of board the smuggler ship and kind of reason with them, you know, and maybe the stakes are different for these smugglers in this module. I don't know. It's not really clear from the module, but I could see a situation where maybe you just kind of convince them like, hey, is this really worth it? Like we're here now. And while we're here, we're going to take a look around. Yeah,
that would work if your PCs were still doing the mission they'd been tasked with. However, in my game,
yeah, how did yours go?
They climbed on board and just basically signed up to join the crew and sailed away. And then I just thought, oh, well, okay. Although luckily, you know, you do have complete information about what the smugglers are doing. So I just had them accompany them on their journey. And in fact, what they are doing is smuggling. The super secret thing is that they're smuggling weapons to an outlaw, is it lizard man colony?
They're lizard men, yeah. Lizard folk, I guess.
Yeah, whereas, of course, in colonial Brazil, I was able to make the lizard folk simply encantado, sort of water sprite allies of a quilombo of escaped slaves out in the jungle. Good. That's providing a slightly meatier... Actually, I was about to say a meatier moral quandary, but one of the commendable things I would say about the follow-up adventure is that it's actually about how you discover that maybe you need to help the lizard men instead of just showing up and burning down their village. So that basically I had them sign up with the smugglers. We did a kind of cliched pirate adventure, and then the Navy showed up to try and capture everyone, and they had a thrilling chase and escape, and that was what I ended up with. But, of course, the module doesn't really... I don't think it gives you a great reason for the player characters to actually want to go and do this arresting the smugglers. That's kind of the issue for me.
Yeah, it's a very it's a little ham-fisted. There are actually they present 7 possible ways, or maybe 8 possible ways you can kind of convince the player characters to do this, and none of them are super convincing, right? It's like, why would the players even do this? I don't know, but whatever. That's how these older modules tend to be, I think. So questions I have questions about this assassin, Ned Shakeshaft. You mentioned him briefly at the top. He's in the haunted house portion. He is quote unquote tied up, and allegedly tied up by, I don't know if they ever even say, but his story is that he's a thief who broke into the house and, please untie me and help me and I'll show you where, everything is, or something like that, right? I found Ned Shakeshaft, this character, to be completely unbelievable. His story was just so unbelievable, and I don't know why the players would ever trust him, right? And the module actually emphasizes that you have to play this character very carefully, or the PCs will realize that, in fact, he's there to rat them out to the smugglers, right? The whole thing just seems so weirdly intricate and unbelievable. How did it go in your game?
Well, I said earlier I didn't have to change much to run this in the Elephant and Macaw banner, but this encounter changed almost immediately, because one of the sort of spiritual powers that you might get if, for example, you're playing the pre-generated PC nun, Sister Vittoria, is that you can sense evil, as in, and it's not like evil as in alignment, but rather evil in the more general sense of, is some harm going to come to me if I do X? So as soon as they walked in the room, they knew that he was lying to them, but of course they didn't know why or exactly what about. So they just kind of looked at him and went, well, I don't know, we don't really trust him. Yeah, let's just leave him tied up. And that's basically what they did. And I think later they kind of brought him out of the house, but I think even without the magic powers happening, they would have immediately twigged that something was up. So I don't know that it's a problem that he's unbelievable, because he's just there as a sort of weird, what do we do now thing. It did slightly help his story that due to a random encounter on the ground floor, they had bumped into some other thieves who'd broken into the house. But they still knew he was lying. So he told the story, I got attacked by other thieves. Which that could be true, but then they knew he was lying anyway, so it was very confusing for everyone.
Yeah, I don't know, that I read that encounter, I was like, this is dumb, and I'd probably just ditch it personally. Okay, so my other question involves the Magic Mouth on page 7. Listeners, Magic Mouth is a spell in D&D where you cast it on something, and then there's this like a literal mouth that appears and like says, dire warnings or whatever, right? And the Magic Mouth says, "Welcome, fools, welcome to your deaths," right? Followed by a, quote, prolonged burst of insane and fiendish laughter. The first part of my question here, Tom, is, did you do this? And the second part of my question is, will you do this?
What do you mean by will I do this? As in if I run it again? Or?
No, like right now, will you do this?
Oh, yeah, sure. Because, I'll answer the first part of your question, because I did do this, because it was almost one of the first encounters they had in the house. They kind of went round the back and came in through the patio. And then the thing is, you have to do this, and you have to do it the same way both times. So I had to try and remember exactly how I'd done it the first time, namely, "Welcome, fools! Welcome to your deaths! Ha 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 ha!" And then kind of make sure I replicated that, because that is the clue that not is all as haunted as it seems. In a Scooby-Doo, it would be, wait a second, that's just a cassette player on the back of a cardboard cutout of a bear.
Exactly.
But in this case, it's because it's only repeating every time you trigger it, you know that it's not a real ghost. It's something else. So, yeah.
Nice. Let's go to the chain lightning round. Tom, kick us off.
There is an illustration on page 25 of an imprisoned sea elf, and it's done in a perspective that's kind of disorienting and a little bit otherworldly, and is just right.
At one point, you can find a treasure chest that has a needle trap in it. The needle trap does not hurt you. All it does is inject a little bit of blue dye into your skin so that the owner of the chest can see if his fellow smugglers were trying to get into it. Just thought that was a real dick move by that guy, and I kind of love it.
Classic OSR. There is a handout you can get, which is actually, although it's not explained when you receive it, the key to the smuggler's lantern flashing code to signal the ship when it arrives. And it's not too cryptic, but once you've worked it out, there's all kinds of things you might do with that knowledge. And having a nice free-form discussion to figure out what to do with it was a good bit of the game.
There's an illustration on page 14 that is probably the single worst illustration I have ever seen in a role-playing game book. It is just dreadful.
That wizard, mate.
It's dreadful in composition. It's dreadful. It's terrible, which, it has to count for something, being the worst I've ever seen.
It's a full page as well. It's bravura. That's what it is. I love that the smugglers' reaction to moving into their secret basement den and discovering skeletons next door was to just lock the door and try to forget about it.
Finally, I love the pseudo-dragon pet of one of the lizard men who are in the fore cabin. This little pseudo-dragon has a very particular set of priorities when determining who it will attack. Like, it prefers druids to clerics and, and so forth. Like, it has this very particular set of priorities, and then, later, if you kill the lizard men, it might, befriend you. I don't know. Just thought it was a weird detail. Let's go to the Expert Delve. It's the Expert Delve. Tom, what are we talking about today?
Well, I think we are in broad agreement that the second ship-bound half of the adventure is not as well served as the first by the text of the module. So let's rectify that by talking about seafaring adventures.
Oh, I'm excited. This is good. Yeah, I love it. I am a former member of the United States Navy. I am a sailor to my core, even though I was only in the Navy for 4 years, but I spent most of those 4 years at sea. And so, yeah, I'm very into this. I cry whenever I hear anchors away. So that's how much of a sailor I am. In fact, I'm just going to keep going here. In fact, in the film Iron Man 2, there is a part where Stark is presenting these robot things, like these defense robot things for the various branches of the United States military. And every time he introduces one of the robots, that branch's little song plays in the background. And if you aren't in the service, you don't know it, you don't recognize it. But whenever the Navy robot stepped forward and Anchors Away played in the background, I teared up for that brief moment during Iron Man 2. So
amazing. Well, I cannot quite lay claim to having a seafarer's soul as you can, but my first job out of college was on a pirate ship, and it's all been downhill from there. So I worked on the refit of the Golden Hind replica, which you can see in London to this day, and we kind of took it down to the Southampton boat show, where we kind of cruised in, fired the cannons off, and opened the show. So I lived on board and had my own hammock and sea chest for about 6 months, I think. And nice. I'd done a whole lot of sailing when I was a kid as well. But yeah, it was a very formative experience for me, as you can probably imagine. And one of the things that's always struck me from that time, and you and I have sort of briefly mentioned this on the podcast before, is that the kind of feeling of being in a crew is not like being friends with people who you don't have to spend all your time with. And it's not like working in any kind of team or of either sporting or work variety. And that this has not been... It's a thing that I don't think any role-playing game has really attempted to create or describe in any way. So that's something I'm kind of interested in and would love to see realised one day.
Yeah, well, so this is great. I mean, so now that we've established our sea leg bona fides here, I think what we're talking about here is how to make seafaring, seagoing adventures more immersive, more realistic, more true, I guess, and more satisfying. What do you think? Yeah,
more satisfying maybe, because I don't think... I mean, I also remember the bad parts of being at sea, so maybe not too realistic. Because the thing is, yeah, more kind of true feeling or more distinctively nautical. Because I think it's also important to lean into the cliches in a fantasy adventure. When we were playing this here in Hong Kong, one of the players, just after they'd signed up on the ship, kind of said to me, I've been playing RPGs for 20 years, but this is the first time I've done a pirate adventure. And I thought immediately, well, then my friend, you're going to have a pirate adventure. So, parrots, people, treasure chests, belaying orders, belaying pins, everything. I just thought, okay, everything that's obvious, I'm just going to include it. And everyone loved it because cliches are boring when you're watching them. But if you're the one doing them, suddenly it becomes just really fun.
I agree completely. It goes back to something that I've talked about for a long time now, this idea that role-playing games want easy touchstones. Role-playing games want what we might in some other context refer to as a cliche in a role-playing game that can be quite powerful, right? You know, the biggest difficulty in role-playing games, in my opinion, is getting everybody on the same page in terms of their headcanon, in terms of like just the theater of our minds, like kind of like syncing up and having it feel like we're all doing the same thing, right? And so, you know, easy touchstones are a great way of doing that. So like you said, the parrot thing, you know, all the like the pirate terminology, all that stuff might seem kind of like cheesy in some other context. In a role-playing game, it can be quite powerful because it brings everybody's headspace together. So let's talk about some of our tips here. So why don't we kick off here? I think a really good thing to do is to learn some terminology. Okay. You don't have to go crazy here, but some basic nautical terminology goes a really long way toward creating a sense of authenticity, I suppose, at the table. So for example, you know, knowing that as you face the front of the ship, port is on the left, starboard's on the right, you know, terms like bulkhead, deck, just little simple basic terms, you know, are good to have in your repertoire. Learn what the basic parts of a ship are called. Also, the word is spelled boatswain, but it's pronounced bosun. And the word is spelled forecastle, but it's pronounced forecastle. Those are some little details like that I think go a long way.
Yeah, although just to throw out some tall ships terminology, just for minor items, if you need the Age of Sail equivalent of technobabble, I would suggest the following are all things that someone could be ordered to go and check on. So go and check on the deadeyes, whippings, clews, buntlins, gaskets, shrouds, ratlins.
You're just showing off now.
I literally just sat there trying to think, what are all the things I was forced to mend? And then I wrote them down.
Nice. You know, I think it's really important when you're running a seafaring adventure, maybe not really important, but I think it's something you want to consider, is what is life at sea actually like, right? One thing that I would point out that I think is really important for the types of role-playing game adventures we can be expected to do at sea is that the spaces on a ship are much smaller and much tighter than you may realize. Even looking at a map, like the map in The Sinister Secret of Saltmarsh, you may not quite realize just looking at that map how confined that actually is. Even on a modern day, you know, U.S. Navy vessel like I was on, it's very confined. The passages are narrow. The overheads are low, right?
Yeah, where I slept on the gun deck of the Hind, it was actually, I guess, maybe a bit less than 5 foot between the floor and the ceiling. So you always had to walk around just kind of bent over at like a number 7. I remember a friend of mine came to look at the ship one time where he just looked at the gun deck, went, I can't go in there, I've got back problems, and just proceeded directly to the cargo hold, which, because it's underwater, is a bit taller. So yeah, definitely you're, well, for a start, you're constantly banging your head on stuff, and it's dark down there as well. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think another sort of environmental thing to be mindful of and to possibly emphasize, especially if your characters are not accustomed to being on a ship and they are just arriving on a ship, you know, for whatever reason, the smell is terrible. This is just a thing. When you have this many bodies in this confined space, the smell is quite bad. It's not as bad on ships as it is on, say, submersibles, like in a submarine, where it's truly nauseatingly revolting. But it's just something, you know, something you can emphasize in your descriptions, right? Like for first time, for characters who are first entering the ship, right? Like emphasize like just the smell of just confinement, you know, and body odor and whatnot. It's just quite gross. Another thing is that in a storm, it's very difficult to keep your feet under you. This is really, really important. I have run many adventures on ships and storms happen, and I probably don't do a good enough job of this, but you really, really, really want to emphasize just how hard it is to stay on your feet when in a storm. It's so dangerous, right? I mean, even on modern day ships, like the smaller ones at least, it's very, very dangerous. Like in a split second, you can be smashed up against the bulkhead, right? And it just takes letting go of like one thing you're holding onto briefly before you are just plastered, right? And so on a historical ship or a sort of like older technology ship, like you might be expected to do in a fantasy game, this is especially the case, right? This is why sailing was so dangerous back then, right? It was an incredibly dangerous job. It does not take much to throw you off, to throw you off into the water or to like, or for you to be crushed by something.
Yeah, you have these little weightless moments. Actually, that never happened to me while sailing in Europe, but you've just reminded me once or twice, getting the ferry home to when I lived on a different island in Hong Kong just before a typhoon came in. So like the waves are crazy and you just have, there's always someone vomiting on the deck below, which is, revolting. And then the smell. And then, you just have these lurching moments. And of course, stuff starts falling over. And if earlier in the adventure, somebody failed a rope tying check, have whatever they were supposed to be lashing to the wall, smash and break. That should be pretty good. It's pretty nasty.
I'd also like to talk a little bit about what I consider to be the sort of two very different halves or the juxtaposition of the sailor's life. Like most days at sea are incredibly boring. I don't know where your space is to explore this in a fantasy adventure game, but depending what type of game you're playing, this might be an interesting theme to explore. It's incredibly dull. There are weeks at a time where nothing is happening, right? And you're just doing the most dreary, repetitive tasks. And within that boredom, that's kind of like where sailor culture develops, right? Because you have to find ways of amusing yourself. You have to find ways of occupying your time. Was that your experience, Tom?
I only did shorter journeys, but even within just like a few days at sea, there's not a lot going on. And you have to put up with each other's company, which is one of the weird things about being in a crew, right? Like you don't like someone, but you can't leave. So what are you going to do?
Yeah, I would be underway for, months at a time, right? And sometimes there would be stretches like weeks long stretches where where we weren't anywhere. We weren't pulling into port. We weren't, we were just out at sea. And that repetition, that boredom, that dreary, like never ending feeling, like can be quite pronounced in the sailor's life, right? The opposite side of that, though, what I think makes the sailor's life super interesting is when you do hit a port, finally, there's a sense of like wonder about it, right? Like it's a very wondrous kind of thing. Like you're in this new place, this new land with new people. You've been cooped up for so long and you're ready to just like get out there and explore and do and spend your money and, and just go crazy, right? That back and forth of the sailor's life is really important. And I think that like, depending on what kind of game you're running, I think you might have some space to explore those themes. And then I guess the other thing I'll say about like life at sea, and this is almost certainly not the case of like what you did, Tom, but like in professional navies, it's quite gay. Okay. It can be quite gay. It's very similar to like a prison, honestly, like, a space that's mostly or largely or entirely men cooped up, trapped. Homosexual relationships, even just like temporary ones, like is a thing that happens aboard ships. And it's not spoken of, often, but it's a thing. Like everyone knows it happens, right? And so that's another like interesting sort of like cultural aspect of the sailor's life that I think a lot of people don't talk about or acknowledge, but I assure you is definitely a thing. And that kind of like leans into or kind of like segues into portraying sailors. And we've kind of touched on this a little bit already, but the sense of camaraderie or esprit de corps between sailors is massively important, right, Tom?
Yeah. Even on a sort of not particularly life or death short kind of voyage like I was doing. But actually it is that serious because when you're rigging the foremast on a galleon, the knots you're tying today are going to support somebody who's going aloft tomorrow. And if you mess it up, they're going to fall off the boat and they're going to die, or at least massively injure themselves. And that fact that you have to rely on each other so much creates this just huge solidarity where, we'd be going down the pub in London if we were allowed out into Woolwich or whatever of an evening, and if somebody got a bit aggro with one of our crew, even if it was that guy Dave that we didn't like, everyone would back him up straight away, in a way that sort of doesn't really make that much sense, except that you have that just requirement for each other.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. It's a very different thing than being in a 9-to-5 work situation. I think it's even distinct from being like in other types of military service, quite frankly, because it is so much more about, I don't know, I'll probably get in trouble by saying this, but I just feel like there's a very particular kind of culture. All the, and I'm speaking of like United States armed services, but all the armed services have their own culture and their own esprit de corps and their own like way of like, being around each other and stuff and camaraderie. But there's a particular kind of like culture aboard a ship, right? And it's a culture informed by great long stretches of boredom, moments of intense danger, because that can happen, right? It doesn't take much, like I said, for like someone to, to fall overboard or whatever, that kind of thing, punctuated by these exhilarating like releases of being in port, right? It just creates a different kind of vibe. And I think it's difficult to overstate it, I guess, but it's definitely something that like at the game level, at the very least, like Tom said, like keeping that like idea of like, no matter what, these shipmates look out for each other, right? These sailors look out for each other. That's very, that's a simple thing that you can do. Other things about portraying sailors, in my experience, sailors' mouths are absolutely filthy.
100%.
The phrase curse like a sailor is really underselling it. I have heard the most vile, raunchy things you can probably ever even like conceive of come out of sailors' mouths on a regular basis. Disgusting, filthy language is sort of poetry to most sailors, and so that's something you might want to explore. And also, it's a stereotype, but it's true. Sailors love to drink and whore, and that's just the way it is, right?
I live in Hong Kong, also confirmed.
Yes, they just like to drink and whore, and I myself have drinked and whored in Hong Kong. It is all true. And so that's just another thing that like, if you're not at least acknowledging that part of the sailor's life, you're probably not doing it a great justice. Tom, do you have any other thoughts about like the sort of historical or cultural aspects of life at sea?
Yeah, a little bit. Just sort of stuff that's to do with, tall ships, galleons and that, basically. So one thing I have observed during my tenure on the Golden Hind is that sailors really do sing a lot, as advertised in pirate stories. You do it, just to kill time when you're sitting around in the boring parts. But also work songs are really useful when you're, manning the capstan. That's the big windy thing that raises and lowers things, people at home. Or, like raising a yardarm or stepping a mast or whatever. You literally sing to give yourself rhythm. And so everyone starts learning loads of songs that everyone knows, which is kind of weird. And you have this repertoire by the time you've finished. It's really quiet on a sailing vessel. Actually, how noisy is a modern, like, warship?
It depends on where you're at on the ship, but it can be quite quiet. Yeah, it really depends. The higher you go up, the more quiet it is.
Yeah, because, like, I think in, today's world, we tend to associate motion with noise because motor vehicles and all that. But it really is just kind of silent in a way. It's quite hard to imagine.
Oh, and like ships moving across the water. It is quite quiet. Like that's even like the engine rooms can be, on a newer vessel can be like just a low hum.
Yeah. I mean, I remember this elderly guy called Dennis who was brought on to as a pseudo captain to monitor what was going on, just remarking one day, I don't know why you young lot always want to have music on or whatever. Out here at sea is the only place I can get any peace and quiet, which fair observation. And what else? Going aloft. Yeah, that's like as in climbing up the mast to fix and furl sails. I nearly died once in Woolwich, which would be a hell of a way to go. Which is I was alone on the ship. I was just on watch while everyone else was on the shore. So we just docked in the kind of the estuary of the Thames. And I spotted a bit of rigging that had come loose. I thought, I'll just go up and fix that. And, we had safety harnesses and whatever. But to go down from the fighting top, which is like a crow's nest, but not, you had to unclip and go upside down, hand over hand, because it has this sort of reverse shrouds. The sailing fans are loving this technical talk. And, yeah, I buggered it up, basically. I lost my handhold, and I fell. Yikes. And I stuck out an arm to grab something, and I got a ratlin, which is this kind of the ladder rung thing that you're not meant to hold on to in case it breaks anyway. And I grabbed on and I looked down at the water and I thought, okay, I'm not doing that again. So never, ever go up with someone else on the ship. would be my advice to PCs and real people alike. And yeah, that's kind of it, really. Actually, no, there is one more thing that's a historical and not a kind of real-world note, which is that in the golden age of piracy, and therefore the sort of pseudo-sea setting for fantasy role-playing games, a lot of the sailors are playing for massive stakes.
So true, yeah.
There's a big chance they're going to die on this voyage, but if they actually make it home, and if they actually get paid the prize money they're entitled to instead of banged up on a hulk off the south coast of England, they're set for life. Like, the amount of money you would make as just a cabin boy coming back from the Americas was huge. And so the reason they're a bit desperate is because they've got a lot on the line if you kind of show up in your jolly boat and suggest that you come with them to the shore.
Yeah, that historical note's actually really quite good, because I'm a big fan of historical whaling fiction. And that is one of the themes that is constantly addressed in that kind of fiction and nonfiction, right? The idea of like the stakes being so high, right? I mean, stakes from like you said, it's just dangerous. They might die. There's a good chance they'll die, but also particularly in the context of whaling, they may not find a whale, right?
Yeah.
And all of it's been for nothing, right? So yeah, that is a great thing to emphasize as well. Did you have any thoughts about like kind of drilling down a little closer to like just role-playing games, and particularly like ship-based explorations or mysteries and kind of things we should keep in mind?
Yeah, I did, because as I mentioned, I had to think on my feet a bit to come up with the mystery investigation during the Saltmarsh session 2. And okay, so role-playing games are good at the detective thing where you break into someone's office, rifle through their filing cabinet and discover like an incriminating photograph or something. What they're not that good at is the sort of investigating while working passage thing that shows up in a lot of... Like Treasure Island is basically this. You go on a voyage and you have these sort of day-to-day encounters and do normal work. And every so often you say something like, what is the story behind the ruby on the ring that the captain always hides whenever he sees anyone looking at it, and that kind of thing. And yeah, and I think that's a bit of a gap in the repertoire.
Well, how would you handle it? I mean, what are your thoughts there?
What I did do was I went for drama system style scene calling, which is basically where I would go to each player more or less at random and just say, what if this was the movie, what would be the next thing we saw your character doing? And of course, if they said, well, I'm going to wait until nighttime and then sneak into the navigator's cabin, then we might cut to someone who's going to do something earlier instead. But I found that was the best way to handle it. Like, and if they said, oh, I'm going to try and find out about this subject, I would say, well, how would you work that into conversation? Or, do you just ask someone? Do you break a thing open? And I think that's the best way to do it. And that way you can cut from day to day and have the sense of a long voyage happening with things gradually being discovered.
That's really smart. I've handled, like I said, I've done a lot of like seafaring adventures before, and I handle it in a very similar way. Essentially what I do is I just do like a scene per day, right? So, normally a loose connection of scenes in a normal context or in a non-ship based context or non-voyage context might be scenes that all take place within a very compressed time period, like a day or two, right? But what I do on ship-based adventures is, okay, this is the scene for today, right? Like, this is the scene for today. We have a little scene. And then I usually have like something happening at night to mark the passage of time, depending on what the adventure is about. So if there's some kind of like magical influence on the ship that might cause the characters to have strange dreams or something like that, I might like cut to a player and ask them to tell me about their dreams that they had that night or whatever. And then once they do that, the next day we have another daytime scene, and then we cut, kind of go back and forth like that. So basically I just take the normal sorts of investigating and exploring and talking that they would be doing and just really, really like pull it apart and drag it out to be over the course of a number of days. And that totally works fine. But I think like marking the passage of time by like noting, okay, here's the daytime thing, here's the nighttime thing, here's the daytime thing, here's the nighttime thing is a good way of doing that. Any other thoughts here?
No, I think we've covered that pretty well.
Awesome. Well, I would love to hear from listeners about their seafaring adventures and kind of how they've handled them. And because I think this is a great, interesting setting. It's the kind of thing that like you can actually, it has enough like real world historical precedents that you can actually kind of make it feel kind of accurate and lived in, but still in this fantasy context. And so I think it's a great thing to explore. let's go to companion adventures. Hi listeners, I wanted to let you know that the newest issue of Codex, Joy 2, is now available in the Gauntlet's $4 Patreon feed. It's a sequel to the original Codex Joy, and it's terrific. Here is what you'll find inside. Storm Riders, a rules-light game inspired by the action-packed fantasy cartoons of the 1980s, such as Masters of the Universe and Thundercats. A Feast of Jovial Moments, a collection of evocative images for Swords Without Master and other swords and sorcery games. Grandma's Drinking Song, a hilarious songwriting LARP that tells the story of a family of Jewish bootleggers in 1930s New York City. True Beauty, a framework that recontextualizes the game Monster Hearts 2 to be about young queer people of color in the ballroom scene of 1980s Harlem. Our miscellany, 36 local holidays and celebrations, 5 original illustrations, and a gorgeous custom layout by Jake Householder. You can get Codex Joy 2 by making a $4 or higher pledge on the Gauntlet Patreon by November 30th. As a bonus, you will also receive the original Codex Joy. And a quick reminder that back issues of Codex can be found on Drive-Thru RPG. Thanks. It's the Companion Adventures. Tom, what do you got?
I have got 3 films that are basically the same film, and they're all based on the Dr. Sin novels by Russell Thorndike. So this is about the smuggling part, right? Dr. Sin is a sort of village parson who lives near Romney Marshes in England during the olden days. I forget exactly when. Basically, when there's smuggling needed to be done, and he leads a group of outlaws. The films in question are Dr. Sin, 1937, Captain Clegg from 1962, made by Hammer Studios and with Peter Cushing in it, and The Scarecrow of Romney Marsh, which was a Disney film from the 60s, starring Patrick McGoohan out of The Prisoner as the title character. And so, yeah, it's lots of roughly Saltmarshy period. I mean, I can only assume this was the main inspiration for this module, considering it was written in Britain and it's about smuggling. It's this and Jamaica Inn. That's basically the 2 touchstones for that kind of coastal smuggling.
My film TV thing is something more recent. AMC, about a year or 2 ago, had a show called The Terror, and this is about a pair of English vessels in Victorian times trying to chart the Northern Passage. And what I love about The Terror is there's several things. It's a really enjoyable program, but what I love about it in terms of like role-playing games and how it might be useful for you is it really does a good job with like nautical terminology and like life aboard ship. And even though pretty early on in the season, the ships are no longer quote unquote at sea, they get frozen in by icebergs. They get frozen in, but they still maintain their, they still muster, they still maintain their order. All of their lives as sailors like are still like in play, and like all that stuff still shapes out. So it's a great way of like getting a good idea of like what command structure and daily life like as either an officer or a sailor might be. And then also, spoiler alert, it has like a monster. It has a monster. There's a mystery. And so it's also kind of helpful in that way because it gives you a sense of like what it might mean for like a crew of sailors to be caught up in this sort of like fantastical mystery, right? And how to go about that. And it's just very enjoyable too.
All right, let's talk about some music. I have for you something, I think, for the shore side of the adventure, which is Celtic Wedding, an album from 1987 by the Chieftains, with the Breton musicians Nolwenn Mongeret, Bernard Pichard, Alain Guerton, and Michel Berthet. It's largely instrumental, but it has some vocals, but they're all in Breton, so the chances of your table understanding them is relatively slim. And so, yeah, this is like a kind of Celtic music that will sound a little bit different from what you're used to in terms of instrumentation and tunes, and therefore hopefully will be a little bit fantastical.
There's a pretty fabulous collection of sea shanties on YouTube collected by an individual named Matt Deering. It's about 30 minutes long, and what I love about this particular collection is it's entirely vocals. And so it's like maybe 8 to 10 different sea shanties and different groups of people singing them, but it's entirely vocal. There's no instrumental. And what I love about that is it actually sounds a lot like what you imagine these sea shanties might sound like if they were being sung on a ship, while sailors were working. And so I really like that. And if you do a lot of searching around for like sea shanty or working songs by sailors or whatever kind of similar search, for whatever reason, people always want to layer on top like kind of cheesy instrumentation or I don't know, it has a kind of a dumb cartoon quality a lot of the times the way they're presented. And this is a really these are not presented that way. Like it feels very authentic and enjoyable as well.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, especially for work songs, your hands are full, you can't play instruments, so that makes
Precisely,
sense.
Yeah.
As a side question, Jason, what is your favorite verse of What Do You Do with a Drunken Sailor?
So we didn't sing that one. So it's actually really funny you bring this up. In the U.S. Navy, we actually don't. That singing is not a thing. That's more of a historical thing, I think. And I wanted to bring it up earlier when you talked about it, because in modern day U.S. Navy, at least, it's not like singing like that is not a thing. We have like on the deck they have boom boxes playing, like J-Lo or whatever, right?
Theme from Top Gun.
Right, exactly, yeah. So just want to throw that in there. What do you have in terms of books?
The books, probably, Treasure Island, Master and Commander series, all that stuff. But for gaming, I've got a thing you can't really get. Is that useful? Kind of. The Counter-Colonial Heist Crawl is a sort of ongoing project by Richard G., which is not really like out or released or in any kind of coherent form yet, as far as I know. But if you keep an eye on his blog at lurkerablog.wordpress.com, he often posts material about it there. Or just Google Counter-Colonial Heist Crawl, because the only things you'll find are the correct things. He's really got the SEO locked down on that one.
I imagine he does. I'm going to recommend a nonfiction work called In the Heart of the Sea. Or I guess it's nonfiction. It's historical fiction or nonfiction. I can't remember. It's been a long time since I read it, but it's one of my very, very favorite books, probably my top 5 favorite books of all time. It is about whalers in Nantucket and this sort of like grim outcome of a voyage that they were on. And when I mean grim, I really mean that. What I think is really great about it is it also has lots of interesting details about like life at sea, of course, but also what we were talking about earlier about like the stakes of the sailor's life. Like that is quite pronounced in this book, like what it means to be a sailor, how dangerous it is, how high the stakes are. And if you want to explore themes like that in your game, In the Heart of the Sea is really fantastic. And listeners, that's our show. Fear of a Black Dragon is a production of The Gauntlet. If you would like to get in touch with us, I recommend Twitter. We can be found at Gauntlet RPG on Twitter. We still have a G Plus group. It is just go to the community section of G Plus and search for The Gauntlet. You will find us there. We have a website at gauntlet-rpg.com. And we are on Patreon at patreon.com/gauntlet. Tom, thanks so much.
Thank you, Jason. And thank you to Paul for editing.
And listeners, thank you. Take care. That was pretty good.
That's why I make the big podcast bucks, mate. All right.
Yeah, that's pretty good. Pretty good. Our first segment is the basic crawl. The secret of... Then I go and fuck it up the moment I start talking. I know.